So that's a really good question. I like that question. So the question is, the miracles that Jesus performed, were they primarily due to his being deity himself? Did he do those miracles in the power of God, or were they more based on his having faith in the power of the Father? Does that sound like what's being asked? First of all, let me say that I think when we ask these sorts of questions, that God is actually glorified when his people humbly and in love ask these sorts of things and try to get at who God is and his nature. By contrast, Christianity is kind of unique in that way. By contrast, in Islam, there's no real sense of being able to really know God or his purposes. The goal for a Muslim is to obey God. And God himself and the purposes behind his commands are not really discernible. Christianity says quite differently that we are created in God's image, that he is knowable, at least to a great extent, because of creating us in his image. And he's actually glorified when we seek to know him that way. And I would take this question to be right down that alley. The short answer, I think, is that if this is set up as a dichotomy, either Jesus did miracles in his deity or through faith in the Father, I think it's a false dichotomy. The truth is probably that both are going on at the same time. But there is a real sense in which, and certainly the question is narrowed down to the time of Jesus' earthly life, from birth to crucifixion, let's say. Because I think Christian consensus is and always has been that it was his deity that enabled Christ to create the universe, for instance. In the first part of Colossians 1, it specifically refers to Christ, the second person of the Godhead, as the one responsible for the creation of the universe. Now, that's not to say that the Father and the Holy Spirit weren't involved in that, but Christ is distinguished as being the creator of the universe. And certainly that was not based on faith in the Father, but based on his deity that he did that. Then after the resurrection, and even up till today, Christian understanding is that Christ performs miracles out of his deity rather than out of faith. So really the question, I think, has to do with that period of time when he submitted himself to being confined to a human body. And there is certainly a Christian doctrine that says that in coming to earth as a human, in his humanity, Christ set aside some of the power, if you will, some of the attributes of his deity. So for instance, while on earth in a human body, Jesus was temporarily at least not omnipresent, present everywhere in the universe, was also not omniscient, all-knowing. That is, Jesus himself said several times in Scripture that there was a limit to his knowledge relative to the Father's knowledge at that point in time. So I think there really is a sense in which much of the miracle that Jesus did, during that time period was more based in God the Father's program and power, not in his own. Jesus also very clearly said, like in John 5:19, that I do nothing but what the Father tells me to do. Okay, so there is a whole lot of reason to believe that most of Jesus' miracles at that time were more based in his faith in the Father than in his being directly deity. And certainly the most important miracle, that of Jesus rising from the dead, was not Jesus doing it. It was the Father that raised Jesus from the dead, not Jesus himself arising. And so in that particular case, it's very clear that Jesus's part was faith. That is, Jesus went to the cross and endured all of that suffering in trust, in faith that the Father would raise him from the dead. So I tend to answer this question as leaning towards most of Jesus' miracles being done in faith rather than in direct power. Now, I can think of an apparent counterexample, though, and that would be the one that H referred to in his sermon this morning, where Jesus calmed the waves. So Jesus is in the boat sleeping while the disciples are rowing him across the Sea of Galilee, and a storm comes up. And the disciples go to Jesus in fear and say, "Help us, we're going to die, we're going to drown out here." And if I remember the passage right, Jesus doesn't pray to the Father in that instance. Jesus just, when he wakes up and is faced with their fear and the need for allaying those fears, he just immediately says, "Be still," and the waves and winds are still. So I think there is an element where Jesus still had the power to do miracles directly, and that would be one example where he did. But that by and large, in that time of his incarnation and prior to his crucifixion, he chose instead to perform miracles in the name of the Father and through praying to the Father, and certainly in concert with the program of the Father and his own mission statement. Now, if I can, that was kind of a long answer, but so let me take another spin at that, because I think the question highlights a distinction that we often miss relative to Christ's humanity and deity. As modern apologists, we wish that Jesus had been more explicit in the Gospels in claiming to be God himself. We wish he'd just said flat out more often than he did, "I am God." Now, he did, and certainly in a sense in which the Jews of his day recognized it. So Jesus claimed to be in authority to forgive sins. And when he did that in the house preparatory to healing the paralytic, when he did that, the Jewish leaders recognized that as heresy and blasphemy, recognized that as claiming to be God. Right during his trial, what led to his conviction was his claim that in the future we would perceive him, the Son of Man, coming on the clouds with glory. To the Jew, that was a clear claim to deity, and that's when the high priest tore his clothes and said, "What, we don't need to hear anymore. He's just claimed to be God. Let's convict him." That's what led to his conviction. That was the grounds for his crucifixion. But there is a very real sense in which during his earthly ministry, prior to the crucifixion, Jesus intentionally and deliberately de-emphasized his deity and emphasized his humanity. That after the resurrection, Jesus was much more open and accepting of the recognition of his being God. So it's only after the resurrection that Jesus accepts direct worship. He downplayed his deity prior to the crucifixion. And I think there's good reason for that. So let me mention briefly just three of the reasons that the second person of the eternal Godhead came to earth. Three reasons for the incarnation. The first is in order to offer us moral teaching, a moral example, and encouragement in moral things. Basically, to tell us how to live as humans. That was one of the purposes Jesus came in the flesh, teach us how to live, and particularly in a moral sense. Another reason that he came in human flesh was in order to share in the sufferings that being human entails. To share in not only the moral pain and suffering when other people betrayed him and slandered him and that sort of thing, but even to suffer along with us in what's called by philosophers natural evil, earthquakes and winds and such like that. The third reason he came was to live a perfect life, a sinless life, even though tempted with all the temptations of humanity. And by living perfectly and sinlessly, then being qualified to serve as an atoning sacrifice for all the rest of humanity who couldn't achieve such a sinless and perfect life. So if those are three of the main reasons for the incarnation, what I want you to understand is that those all entail emphasizing Christ's human nature and de-emphasizing his deity. In other words, as he's seeking to live a moral life and to provide moral teaching, the connection to us, the idea that we can be encouraged by Christ's life to live well is diminished, isn't it, if we emphasize the fact, well, it was easy for him. He was God. No, he emphasized that he was human throughout that period of his life in order to make the connection with our humanity on moral issues and how to live much more concrete. In the same way as he voluntarily endured the suffering common to all humanity, he avoided whatever temptation there might have been to just smooth things out. And so back to that story in the boat. That was the one instance in which Jesus directly utilized his power over wind and waves, but he did it under compulsion. In other words, he was sleeping in the boat. His program as the incarnated God was to endure such things as storms on the Sea of Galilee, along with the rest of humanity. He was sleeping peacefully, willing to ride out that storm rather than change that circumstance. And it was only because his disciples were afraid for their lives and not perceiving who he really was, that he decided in that particular instance to change the circumstances by calming the storm rather than ride it out in his humanity. And then again, the idea that he came to live a perfect life, and only by doing so could he provide atonement for us in his sacrificial death. Again, that depends upon his living that perfect life, really tempted, as all humans are, by those things that we're tempted by the convenience of cheating or by the seeming gratification of acting out our lusts and things like that. So in that regard, the only reason Jesus' atonement counts for us is because he lived emphasizing his human side, his human nature, not calling in his deity to make such temptations meaningless. So I really do think that we need to recognize the distinction that while incarnated from the time of birth up into the crucifixion, Jesus really did need to emphasize his humanity over against his deity. That after the resurrection, he could accept worship because he had passed the test. In other words, God's raising Jesus from the dead was really a vindication of his success at suffering as a human, as going through human temptation successfully, as living a moral life in his humanity. And it was only once that was all accomplished successfully that God the Father could put a stamp of approval on all that and say, this is my Son. This day I have begotten him. Believe what he has taught you. Do as he has shown you and said. And so it was really only after the crucifixion was accomplished that Christ's deity could come to the fore in subsequent miracles and what have you. And up until that time, most of his miracles would have been done with an emphasis on his human side, trusting the Father's power.